Here's an interesting tech that's gaining traction for its simplicity and effectiveness in mineral processing, sludge waste filtration, water purification, and so on. It involves filtering soil through special geotextile bags. Now, what's the connection to megaliths? Well, maybe just a visual similarity. We can already assume that highly advanced civilizations existed on Earth in the past. So what's new to us is actually something old that's been forgotten. Let's draw a parallel between the megaliths of past civilizations and our modern tech. Take Gornaya Shoria. The megaliths lie there like, as some alternative researchers put it, loaves of bread. That hanging stone, it rests on the ones below, but it could have been made using this very tech. Actually, it's probably closer to alchemy. Let's propose a theory that these megalithic, supposedly natural formations aren't intrusions of mass, but tailings, waste from underground leaching of megaliths. The main idea is that this waste, this sludge, was stored in soft formwork in bags. But these bags, as we understand them, were also megalithic. There's also the theory that holding these huge masses could have been done using some high tech, creating fields that could manipulate material structures, creating effects, including anti-gravity. To handle such masses for pouring megaliths, remember that mega means million and lithanesen means casting. In mountainous conditions, you'd need construction aircraft that could transport these masses by hundreds of thousands of tons. Sounds like science fiction, but science offers no other explanation, preferring to write it off as natural mountain formation. To make it all strong so the bags wouldn't tear, they built fences and created strong formwork, resulting in even blocks. Here we see that the bags were smaller and of different volumes, that is, they weren't standardized like in our civilization. Here, the shape of the stones closely resembles what you'd get from stacking with bag methods. This is a vein of finely dispersed syenite. It could be a filtration, a boundary where a different mixture accumulated and subsequently crystallized into this fine-grained syenite. Here's a plaster-like finely dispersed syenite, and it's quite common between the blocks. Of course, the skeptics will say, where are the bags themselves? Where are the remnants? It's clear that over hundreds, if not thousands of years, the organic matter has decomposed. Maybe it wasn't organic. Maybe it was all removed later, but the seams remained where the bags were immediately removed, or perhaps they dissolved quickly under the action of alkali or acid. After all, the substance used in leaching is unknown to us. As a result, the blocks stuck together, leaving a barely noticeable seam. The chemistry was drained and filtered. It's very disconcerting that there were no standards. Also, it's possible the mass later, breaking down into smaller pieces, different shapes as it crystallized. Okay, let's continue the analogy with modern technology. Modern dewatering technology. Containers come in different sizes and shapes. The dewatered sludge is processed, the bag containers are opened, and the waste, the dry residue, is then disposed of. The geotube dewatering stages are, first they fill it, then dewater it, consolidate it, and the water finally exits through the pores of the walls. Then they dry and retain the sediment. And here, you can see the quality of the outer layers. This is the outflowing water. Ultimately, perfectly clean water comes out. Solid sediment is removed from the geotube containers by a tractor. Note the dry residue. It cracked as it dried. We also see how the megalithic mass in places cracks and forms smaller blocks or intricate stones. Environmentalist concerns disappeared when it turned out that the outflowing water, cleaned off sludge, was cleaner than the river water itself. Here we see cracking during drying. Most likely, similar processes will occur during crystallization. The illustration shows the geotube project in Sweden, a modern example, and the stockpile dumps are very similar to the megaliths near the flooded quarry. Everyone knows the photos of Peruvian megalithic polygonal masonry. There are still disputes whether they were made mechanically or whether it is still casting. Examples where so-called nipples are visible on the blocks, especially add fuel to the fire. What were they for? The official version of these nipples is that they are assumed to be remnants of jumpers that held the stone in the rock when it was separated from the main stone mass. Logical. It is unclear why these jumpers were not removed at the end of the work on creating the polygonal masonry. This is a version of mechanical processing in the formation of nipples. Of course, different alternative researchers have their own theories about how these nipples were formed. For example, maybe it's a hole in the bag where the solution was injected. If we're talking about the concrete version of how the Peruvian megalithic structures were made, the theory is that the nipples are the solution that leaked out through the formwork after the immersion vibrator was removed. As we know, modern technologies use immersion vibrators to make concrete denser and remove all the air bubbles. In our case, they just pushed the vibrator in. It pierced the bag and then they pulled it out after the settling was done. That's why we see one or two spots where the solution leaked out. Since the mass was well compacted, only a little bit leaked out. But questions remain. Why exactly at the bottom of each block? The blocks have straight, flat edges. And why are the blocks so bulging and not with even edges? Again, let's try to use the analogy of dewatering technology. Filtration to this case. What if water or some other water, liquid excess mass, flowed through these nipples and the bags themselves were airtight? There's also a theory about rubber formwork, and they could have done it that way in Egypt too. Assuming then we assert that granite was obtained like Siberian megaliths from liquid rock by thickening, filtering the solution, and further crystallization. Interesting questions and interesting answers arise in the analysis of this methodology of paste like rock thickening. Firstly, this method of extracting useful materials is very environmentally friendly. That is, the indigenous people of the earth who cared about the environment were engaged in this. Rock was extracted from the earth. The necessary substances were extracted from the rock, and the remains were stored in the form of mountains, in the form of megaliths, and also used in the casting of all kinds of structural elements of ancient cities. Automated devices with a full data set of elements with the possibility of making individual changes were probably used. For example, the base of the columns is one material, the finish is another. Monuments, works of art, statues, and much more are different materials of varying strengths, and all this was also produced on a megalithic scale. Cities were cast and prepared for use like pies in grandma's kitchen. Also on Earth, we see a huge amount of barbaric mining shown in the material. Earth is a giant mine. As a result of removing a 100-meter layer of earth in huge areas, deserts have been created on Earth and unnecessary remains have been dumped into heaps or in the form of sand, silicon dioxide, which fills most deserts. Barbaric looting began in the early 18th century, and the creation of megaliths can probably be attributed to the Middle Ages. At the same time, in both cases, as we see, the same indeed megalithic machinery was utilized, actually exceeding our current civilization's development.